Welcome back to the Battlefield Brief. My name is Craig, and I'm glad you're here. This week, we are breaking down what is happening across the competitive Warhammer 40,000 scene, including the latest tournament results, faction win rates, player trends, and the armies making the biggest impact on the meta. This week's report does not include the WTC tournament results. I'm hoping to have a video later this week with WTC-only data. Using tournament data from 3 tournament tracking sites, the Battlefield Brief grabs the information after the final tournament ends and builds these reports so we can spot the important trends and prepare for the next event. First, let's turn to meta balance and focus on what stands out this week. This week's meta balance score is 57.1%, with 16 factions inside the target range. This has been steadily dropping the last 3 weeks and will be interesting to watch as codecs begin to be released soon. The important point is not to read too much into every value, but to identify the results that most clearly shape the competitive picture. Keep that result in mind as we move to all faction win rates. Next, let's take a look at the overall shape of the meta. This chart shows every faction's win rate for the week, with the 45 to 55% balance zone highlighted in the middle. Deathwatch leads the field at 63.6% across 9 players, 9.9 percentage points above its 4-week average. Among its undefeated and one-loss lists, Priority Assets was the most used disposition. With Deathwatch having a small player base of 9 players, this result is not meta-changing. It is a few players having great results at the tournament they played. Dark Angels is number 2, at 60.3% across 56 players, 3.9 percentage points above its 4-week average. Among its undefeated and one-loss lists, Reconnaissance was the most used disposition, and it is good to see them on top of Orcs this week. Dark Angels have been quietly moving up week over week. Orcs are number 3, at 57.1% across 60 players, 2.0 percentage points below its 4-week average. Among its undefeated and one-loss lists, Taken Hold was the most used disposition. Chaos Daemons are number 4, at 56.2% across 47 players, 0.8 percentage points above its 4-week average. Among Daemon's undefeated and one-loss lists, Priority Assets was the most used disposition. Genestealer Cults are number 5, at 54.4% across 20 players, 6.1 percentage points above its 4-week average. In the upper half of the balance zone, from 50 through 55%, are Leagues of Votann, Space Wolves, Adeptus Custodes, Emperor's Children, Adeptus Sororitas, Tau Empire, Drukhari, and World Eaters. In the lower half of the balance zone, from 45 up to 50%, are Space Marines, Thousand Suns, Imperial Knights, Blood Angels, Necrons, Chaos Space Marines, and Eldari. And below the 45% balance line this week are Tyranids, and for the first time in 11th, Grey Knights, along with Black Templars, Death Guard, Adeptus Mechanicus, Chaos Knights, Imperial Agents, and Astra Militarum. Small player samples this week include Deathwatch with 9 players and Imperial Agents with 4 players. As we can see, small player counts can move quickly up and down the chart. This is a 1-week faction snapshot, so win rate is best read alongside representation and the 4-week trend. That provides context before we move to faction performance versus balance zone. Next, let's look at which factions are gaining momentum and which ones cooled off this week. Positive movement is shown in green and negative movement in red. Deathwatch was one of this week's biggest movers, finishing 9.9 percentage points above its 4-week average. This big swing is a result of a small player count this week. Drukhari also was a big mover, finishing 6.2 percentage points above its 4-week average. Astra Militarum took one of the biggest steps back, finishing 9.1 percentage points below its 4-week average. This chart measures movement against a 4-week average rather than overall faction strength, so the biggest swings are the story rather than every bar. Keep that result in mind as we move to competitive list conversion. From there, let's look at which factions are turning tournament entries into top finishes. Combining undefeated and one-loss lists helps separate armies that are simply popular from those repeatedly reaching the top tables. Orcs put up 30 undefeated lists and 94 one-loss lists for 124 top finishes overall. Space Marines put up 23 undefeated lists and 84 one-loss lists for 107 top finishes overall. Necrons put up 23 undefeated lists and 65 one-loss lists for 88 top finishes overall. Raw top finish counts still favor factions with more representation, so the useful question is whether the leading armies combine broad participation with repeated high finishes. Keep that result in mind as we move to most played factions. After that, let's look at which factions players are actually bringing to the table. This chart ranks the most represented armies in the current GT field and shows where player interest is concentrated. The current snapshot includes 1,073 players across the faction field. Space Marines ranks number 1 in player representation with 79 players, or 7.4% of the field. Necrons ranks number 2 in player representation with 66 players, or 6.2% of the field. Tau Empire ranks number 3 in player representation with 60 players, or 5.6% of the field. Representation matters for preparation, but popularity by itself is not evidence of competitive strength. Next, let's look at how players are building their armies across the 5 dispositions. This chart shows the share of undefeated and one-loss lists and what disposition got them to finish at the top tables. This chart is representing 1,170 undefeated and one-loss lists. Take and hold is the most common direction, with 292 lists, making up 25.0% of the classified field. Purge the Foe is next, with 288 lists, and a 24.6% share, just 0.4 percentage points behind Take and Hold. Priority Assets dropped a little from last week, to 20.1%. That wraps up the meta content for the week, as we move to look at the events. Now, let's look at where the biggest competitive gatherings happened this week. This chart ranks the largest events by attendance, and shows which tournaments contributed the most players to the weekly sample. This week's dataset includes 24 events and 1,137 players. The Warhammer Open Newport had the largest attendance, with 190 players, accounting for 16.7% of all event players. The Upkeep Games GTI 2026 was number 2 by attendance, with 123 players, accounting for 10.8% of all event players. Large events carry meaningful sample weight, but no single tournament should be treated as the entire meta. Keep that result in mind as we move to the Warhammer Open Newport review. Now, let's take a closer look at the largest event of the week and the list that came through the field on top. Warhammer 40,000 Grand Tournament Warhammer Open Newport was the largest event of the week, with 190 players, and was classified as a major. The event represented 16.7% of all players in the weekly event dataset. Richard Siegler posted the top recorded result at 8-0, piloting Adeptus Mechanicus. The list used the Skitarii Hunter cohort detachment under the Reconnaissance disposition. Congratulations to Richard Siegler and to Adeptus Mechanicus. The event size, winning faction, detachment, disposition, and record together provide a useful snapshot of one of the week's most important competitive results. It is a strong result from one of the biggest competitive stages of the week. That wraps up this week's Battlefield Brief. The numbers tell us where the meta stands today, but the real value is understanding where it may be heading next. Keep an eye on the factions gaining momentum, the armies consistently reaching the top tables, and the matchups you are most likely to see at your next event. Let me know in the comments what you're playing, what stood out to you this week, and which faction or tournament list you'd like us to take a closer look at next. If this briefing helps you prepare, consider subscribing so you don't miss next week's report. Until then, good luck at the tables, and I'll see you in the next Battlefield Brief.